In this video, I will be comparing results from various journals in order to deduce whether eccentric and concentric contractions improve muscular strength equally, or if one is more superior to the other. Before this, however, we need to understand what concentric and eccentric contractions are and what they do. Concentric contractions can be defined as a muscle tensing in order to create a force greater than a resistance, leading to a shortening of a muscle. This shortening of a muscle creates a movement which is known as the positive phase. Typically, concentric contractions can only be handled under submaximal loads, less than 1 repetition max. This is due to the fact that, as mentioned previously, concentric contractions can only occur by a muscle creating greater force than a resistance. So, without external support, i.e. a spotter, it is impossible to go through the positive phase of an exercise with a supramaximal load, greater than 1 Rm. An example of a muscle contracting concentrically would be the bicep during the positive phase of a bicep curl. As the bicep builds tension greater than the resistance from the dumbbell, it shortens, as a result, causes the forearm to flex at the elbow. Eccentric contractions, on the other hand, can be defined as a muscle tensing to the point where it creates less force than a resistance, causing the muscle to lengthen. The movement created from the muscle lengthening is known as the negative phase. Due to the fact that a muscle doesn't create more force than a resistance during eccentric contractions, it is possible to handle supramaximal as well as submaximal loads during the negative phase. However, if supramaximal loads are used, the muscle fibres in that muscle will be broken down more severely, likely leading to more intense delayed onset muscle soreness, or DOMS for short, and will also require a longer recovery period. An example of a muscle contracting eccentrically under a submaximal load would be the bicep during the negative phase of a bicep curl. The bicep tenses to the point where it produces less force than a dumbbell's resistance, causing the forearm to extend at the elbow. There have been several journals published trying to answer the same question, and in 2008, Boyd et al. Compiled results from 20 different journals into a systematic review containing a meta-analysis. The 20 journals had a combined number of 678 participants, not including dropouts, 234 with concentric focus, 237 with eccentric focus, 24 both eccentric and concentric equally, and the remaining 183 either served as controls or performed some other exercise. Training interventions for these participants ranged from 4 to 25 weeks with a mean frequency of 2.9 sessions per week. The studies were categorised depending on the mode of strength measured: eccentric, concentric, isometric and total strength, and was further divided by how strength was measured: average peak torque, which were recorded in forest plots, and 1 RMs, which were recorded in a table. We'll start off by looking at the relevant data shown in the forest plots. The first two forest plots we'll look at, Figure 1 and Figure 2, compare eccentric to concentric training on eccentric strength improvements. Figure 1 has been split into two subgroups. Subgroup 2.2.1 contains studies with matched testing and training velocities, and subgroup 2.2.2 contains studies with mismatched testing and training velocities. However, there are only two studies in subgroup 2.2.2, and the average of their results crosses the line of null effect, the vertical line, which implies that the results from this subgroup are statistically insignificant, meaning that they don't have any effect on the overall average for this figure. Only one of the studies in subgroup 2.2.1, on the other hand, crossed this line, meaning that the results were statistically significant, and as we can see by the average, Figure 1 favours eccentric to concentric training for improving eccentric strength. Unlike Figure 1, Figure 2 only has one subgroup which looks at higher eccentric versus concentric training intensity. This is because no studies tested training eccentric and concentric at equal intensities with the aim to improve eccentric strength. As we can see, the averages from the results also favour eccentric over concentric training for improving eccentric strength. The next forest plots we'll look at, Figure 3 and Figure 4, are a comparison of eccentric to concentric training on concentric strength. Figure 3 has been divided into two subgroups. Subgroup 2.3.1 shows results with matched testing and training velocities. Subgroup 2.3.2 mismatched testing and training velocities. Figure 4, meanwhile, only has one subgroup which looks at higher eccentric versus concentric training intensity. What's interesting about Figures 3 and 4 is that the averages of all the subgroups cross the line of null effect. So whilst initially it looks like the results favour concentric training for improving concentric strength on both figures, there is no actual statistical significance to the results, meaning that it cannot be said whether eccentric or concentric training favours concentric strength. The final forest plots we'll look at, Figure 5 and Figure 6, are comparisons of eccentric to concentric training on total strength, which they have calculated as the average of eccentric, concentric and isometric strength. This figure contains two subgroups. Subgroup 1.1.1 is higher eccentric versus concentric training intensity, and subgroup 1.1.2 is comparable eccentric and concentric training intensities. If we look at the averages of both subgroups, only subgroup 1.1.1 has any significant results, which, as we can see, implies that eccentric training is slightly favoured over concentric training for improving total strength. The two subgroups in Figure 6 are subgroup 2.1.1, matched testing and training velocities, and subgroup 2.1.2, mismatched training velocities. The two studies in subgroup 2.1.2 cross the line of null effect, making that subgroup statistically insignificant, and the average results from 2.1.1 correlate with what has been suggested in Figure 5. Now that we've looked at all the relevant data from the forest plots, here is the last of the study results in the form of a table, Figure 7. The table has been split into 6 headings: outcomes, subgroup analyses, individual studies, N, number of participants, weighted mean difference, overall effect measured with a p-value, heterogeneity also measured with a p-value, and finally interpretation. We'll start off looking at the first outcome, total strength, which has 3 subgroups. The first subgroup looked at the results from studies with higher or comparable eccentric to concentric training intensities. It contained 4 studies and combined a total of 72 participants. It was concluded that there was no difference in change to total strength between eccentric and concentric training. The second subgroup compares higher eccentric to concentric training intensities. It contains 2 studies and a total of 38 participants. What this subgroup found was that there was statistically a greater increase in total strength in eccentric compared with concentric trainers. The third and final subgroup for total strength look at comparable eccentric and concentric training intensities. This subgroup contains 2 studies with a total of 34 participants. Once again, it was concluded that there was no difference in change in total strength among eccentric compared with concentric trainers. The second outcome, eccentric strength, only had one subgroup, which was higher eccentric versus concentric training intensities. This contains 2 studies and a total of 38 participants. It was stated that there was statistically a significant greater increase in eccentric strength for eccentric trainers in comparison to concentric trainers. The third and final outcome, concentric strength, had 3 subgroups. The first being higher or comparable eccentric versus concentric training intensities, with 4 studies and 72 participants. The second subgroup, higher eccentric versus concentric training intensities, with 2 studies and 38 participants. And the third subgroup, comparable eccentric and concentric training intensities, with 2 studies and 34 participants. The results from all 3 of these subgroups had been interpreted the same way, there was no difference in change in concentric strength among eccentric trainers compared with concentric trainers. After all this, Boyd et al. Summarised that eccentric training performed at high intensities is associated with greater improvements in total and eccentric strength compared with concentric training. However, despite there being no significant difference, concentric training showed a trend towards greater improvement to concentric strength compared to eccentric training. So, all of the evidence suggests that eccentric contractions performed at high intensity are superior to concentric contractions for improving all-round muscular strength.